Is there such a thing as racism? Is there such a thing as white people? There's an old atheist argument when the Christian comes to the atheist. The Christian says, "Why do you hate God?" And the atheist says, "I don't. I just don't believe in God." The status quo on the left right now is to say that you can't be anti-white, you can't be racist against white people, because white people don't exist. If they don't exist, how can you hate them? It's a false category, it's a social construct. If that's the case, then what do we make of Jews? Do Jews exist? I mean, sure, there are Jews who live in England, who live in Russia, who live in Germany, but are they a cohesive group? Is there any meaning to the word Jew? Well, some Jews say that Judaism is a religion, and if you practice the religion, you're a Jew. But what is Judaism? Is Judaism the Torah? Is it the Talmud? Is Judaism Tikkun Olam? What is Judaism? Is it Reform? Is it secular? Is it Orthodox? If we can't agree on a definition of what constitutes the Jewish religion, then we can't refer to millions and millions of people as Jews because they hold radically different religious beliefs. We could at least say with Christianity that every single Christian on the face of the earth believes in or puts faith in or worships Jesus Christ. That is a single unifying principle of all Christians all over the world. Jews, some people who identify as Jewish are atheists, some are agnostic, some people read the Torah, some people read the Talmud. There's a small sect of Jews who live in Ukraine who say that we're the original Jews because we reject the Talmud, the oral law, we only follow the Torah. And they believe that no other Jews across the earth are Jewish. They are the only Jewish Jews. Now, some people say Judaism is just an ethnicity. But is that accurate? I mean, some Jews are black, some Jews are Asian, some Jews are Caucasian. So are Jews an ethnicity? Do they share a common heritage? Do they have a common phenotype? Do all Jews look the same? Do they all have black hair? Do they all have curly hair? Do they all have big, long, hooked noses? These are stereotypes that we have Jews in the same way we have stereotypes about white people. But just as we said before, the left doesn't accept the validity of the category white. It has no meaning. It's just skin color. Well, Jews don't even have their own special skin color. I mean, at least white people have their own special skin color that differentiates themselves visually from other races. Jews don't have that. So if whites do not constitute a group, Jews also don't constitute a group. And just as it's impossible to be anti-white, it's impossible to be anti-Jewish. We could also take blacks. Is it possible to be racist against black people? Well, do black people even exist? Certainly there are Africans who live in Africa, and they have dark skin. But quote-unquote African Americans or African Europeans, blacks in Europe, blacks in America, these people have varying shades of skin tone. They also have varying ancestries and varying privileges. So some black-skinned people are from Africa, they're refugees. Other black people have been living on these continents for hundreds of years. They have a radically different identity, a radically different culture, a radically different history. Some of them are poor, some of them are rich. Some of them have a large degree of African ancestry. Others have more European ancestry than African ancestries, yet still claim to be black. People like Rachel Dolezal, Shaun King. And you might say, oh, well, those are the exceptions that don't disprove the rule, but these are people who are promoted to positions of leadership within black organizations like the NAACP. So the leaders of the black community are not really of full African ancestry. They're actually of significant European ancestry. So we can't really distinguish between Europeans and Africans. We can't speak of a black race. That's just a social construct. And so in the same way that we would reject the term anti-white, we can't refer to someone as anti-white because there is no white race to hate. We can't refer to someone as anti-God because there is no God to hate. We can't refer to someone as anti-Jewish because there are no Jewish people. That's just a social construct. And we can't refer to someone as anti-black or racist against black people because there are no black people. There are just human beings with various skin tones. When the government then classifies people as black and gives them privileges and advantages in the form of affirmative action, then we would have to say that they are reifying a dangerous social construct, a social construct that oppresses people and arbitrarily puts them in a different category other than human, when really there's no differentiation between groups. There's more variation within these supposed social constructs than between them. So there is no anti-white racism, there is no anti-Semitism, there is no racism against black people because none of these groups exist. You could do the same thing with Asians. We could do the same thing with any group. We could deconstruct this group, say it doesn't exist, and therefore it is impossible to discriminate against this group. It's sort of similar to something the Nazis did, where they went beyond calling Jewish people a separate race, which is pretty extreme if you think about it. I mean, they even believed that people from Afghanistan were part of the white race, but they said, no, Jews are their own separate race. They're not part of white people. And furthermore, they said that Jews are not even a race. And, you have like the basic Nazi raceology, you might say, where they would categorize different races, black, white, Jewish. But then there was a higher, slightly more esoteric view of things, that Jews were not a race, they were an anti-race. So whereas every other person on the face of the planet, white people had a race, black people had a race, Asian people had a race, everyone has a race. But Jewish people are unique among all the people on the earth in that they are part of an anti-race. They're part of an anti-race. So deconstructing Jewish raciality in that way, excluding them from everybody else, is what's being done to white people right now. White people are the only racial group that is being deconstructed. White people are not called a race, they're called an anti-race. White people's identity is not real, it's socially constructed, versus black identity, which is promoted and celebrated, Jewish identity, which is promoted and celebrated. Now, I understand the argument that this is done on a pragmatic basis, that historically, because of guns, germs, and steel, Jared Diamond said that Europeans had an unfair advantage. Everyone started the game, but white people started the game with $500 in their pocket. They had an unfair advantage because of environmental reasons. And this resulted in white people oppressing everyone else on the face of the planet, and therefore other people need a leg up. They need a handicap. The problem with that argument is that the same sort of rights and privileges that are given to blacks in terms of being able to promote their identity, celebrate their identity, those same privileges are given to Asians and Jews. And Asians and Jews have more power, more privilege, more disproportionate influence than the average white person per capita. So, in terms of individualism, if we're going to talk about how power and privilege impact people's individual lives, let's say you're an individual black person, you're highly intelligent, you're highly competent, you're willing to work, you follow the law, and yet there's this huge socially constructed superstructure that's bearing down on you and holding you down. Well, you would want some kind of recourse. You would team up with fellow black people to try to create some group solidarity to overcome this additional challenge that you have to face. Even though you yourself didn't choose to be black, you're forced into this situation, so you're forced into this racial collectivism. Well, white people are faced with the same dilemma. White people are discriminated against as a group because of historical reasons. But individual whites never asked to be part of this group. They never were given the choice whether to be white or black or Asian or Jewish. They were just forced into that role. And now they find themselves individually being discriminated against in a college setting, in an academic setting, in the social setting. It would make sense, according to the argument we made 5 seconds ago, for white people then to band together and try to overcome this handicap, irrespective of whatever historical background is going on. That would make sense. So this is just a little brief bit of rhetoric. It's been done before. You can deconstruct whiteness, and that's fine. But if you're not applying the same rules of deconstruction to all social categories surrounding race and ethnicity and ethno-religion, then if you're not doing that, you're being inconsistent, and you're clearly targeting white people. I mean, someone who wants to say, oh, well, race doesn't matter at all, well, great. Then let's let the individuals compete, and if that means, light-skinned people are disproportionately represented in the halls of power, so be it. We're going to ignore race. It doesn't matter. We're going to pretend it doesn't exist. But if you're going to admit that it exists, then from an individual perspective, what's the difference between a white people grouping together to overcome some social handicap and black people grouping together to overcome some kind of social handicap? That's the question. And so really the only dispute here is what social handicaps are at play. And you can try to, in a sort of a Marxist way, you can try to preach to people about how privileged they are and say that, well, because you have it better off, you should flagellate yourself and castigate yourself and handicap yourself, and other people should raise themselves up and be positive. I don't believe in this, taking down the people on the top is going to benefit the people on the bottom. I'm not sure that's the right way to go. I mean, because I've seen people with heavy disabilities, heavy cognitive disabilities, physical disabilities, and there has never been a case that I've seen in my life where taking an athlete and breaking his legs ever benefited the guy in the wheelchair. I've never seen a case where taking a sledgehammer to a smart person's cranium has ever benefited the person who is, terrible at math, or who had dyslexia, or who was autistic, or had some other mental disorder. Hurting the people at the top never helps the people at the bottom. We're living in a Malthusian crisis. Thomas Malthus, hundreds of years ago, predicted that human population was increasing at a rate, and he was looking at Europe specifically, but it was increasing at a rate that was not proportionate with an increase in food production. And eventually, this would lead to serious problems. Now, people have dismissed Thomas Malthus because Europe is not starving, because birth rates have slowed down. Now, Thomas Malthus didn't predict this, but clearly our decline in birth rates is a result of these Malthusian limits. So people are choosing not to have children. And those choices are informed by a media and by a culture that's constructed from the top down. You could call it conspiratorial, but I don't think it's unreasonable to say that smart people read Thomas Malthus and they said, we need to do something about this. Let's promote a culture of antinatalism. That was their choice, which then filtered down to the choices of the average man and woman. And all of these influences are constructed intricately. They inform our opinions on sexuality, on the family, on religion, on the economy, on careers, on our most basic ethics and morals and values. So if that's what's already being done, I would say that it would be far better if we wanted to improve future generations. It would be far better to say, all right, well, we're already using a global corporate media apparatus to effectively program the average man and woman to have less children. Well, why don't we just steer that in such a direction so that it targets people who are less capable, people who are less responsible, people who are more violent, people who are more sadistic, it wouldn't change the moral equation of what's going on. We currently have a system which is telling everyone to stop having kids. And by everyone, I meaning mostly white people in white countries. But it is extending, there are projects opening up in Africa and Asia in terms of family planning, exporting Western values. But if we're already doing this, shouldn't we be doing it in a targeted way where we try to influence the least capable, the most violent, the most sadistic people in society to have the least number of children through economic incentives, through propaganda, through all of the mechanisms that are currently employed, but targeting towards them and relieving the pressure on the people who are most responsible, most caring, most altruistic. That would seem to make sense to me, and you wouldn't need to do it with respect to race. Again, these are very simple qualities. I mean, sadism, we can measure the level of a person's sadism. We can measure it by, for instance, putting people giving them a thought scenario and saying, what would you do? If you saw a fly buzzing around the room, would you try to, release it outside, or would you try to squish it? That's a level of a person's sadism. If you saw a rat, would you try to release it outside, or would you try to kill it? If someone, threatened you, and you were within your legal right to kill them, would you kill them, or would you try to run away or figure out a peaceful solution? These are questions we could ask people to measure their sadism. We could also put people in give them a visual representation of sadism and see how they react. Some people, when they see sadistic action, whether it's violence or meanness or cruelty, they laugh. They think it's funny. They get pleasure from it. Other people are disgusted by that. And so you could measure that, and you could determine who in society, even before any kind of crime has been committed or any kind of aggression, you could determine who's sadistic and who's not sadistic. That's something that you could do without knowing the race of any of the participants. You could do that, and then you could, as we are already, you could be influencing rates of reproduction, but rather than doing it in the blanketed sense for everyone in society, you would target the people who are most sadistic. And maybe you think that sadism is not really an important trait, it should be something else. Some people like to fetishize IQ. That's fine. But do we have morals? Do we have ethics? Do we have values? Can we compare people to one another and say, this is a better character, this is a better personality? Can we compare that? Can we say this person has better morals and ethics and values than that person? Well, certainly we can at least do it in the case of white supremacy, white nationalism. The mainstream is perfectly capable of saying that a white nationalist or a white supremacist has inferior morals, inferior values, inferior ethics. And so they are sort of accordingly doing what I'm already proposing here, which is that they are seeking to wipe white nationalists, white supremacists out of existence through social programming, by destroying their social capital, by getting them fired from their jobs. Clearly, everything I just said, which you can characterize it as evil Nazi eugenics or whatever, but everything I just said is being done only toward self-identified white nationalists, self-identified white supremacists, and sometimes people who even reject those labels, but the media forces it on them. People like Gavin McKines, people like Alex Jones. And then there's sort of a circle outside that where they say, oh, they're not a white supremacist, they're not a white nationalist, but they are enabling white supremacists, they are enabling white nationalists, they are fellow travelers, they are allies. And so they need to be targeted as well. And then you sort of have a confusing gray line between those sort of people and then conservatives at large. Ben Shapiro in the United States is often viewed as a moderating force on the right. He's someone who is skeptical of Trump. He is someone who is certainly skeptical of anti-Semitism and racism. So in the United States, he's viewed as a moderating influence. I just watched an interview with him over in Britain where they described him as an enabler of fascism. They said, well, he's not a fascist, but he's enabling fascism. He's creating a culture, he's creating a space in which fascism can grow and fester and be encouraged. So, the standards are different from country to country, and they're changing over time as we go forward. The standard of who is a white nationalist, who is a white supremacist, who is an enabler, who is an ally, it's becoming broader and broader, and you have to question if it will reach the entire conservative movement. Some people say no, some people say the conservative movement will be allowed to remain intact, but this is disputed. I mean, first they came for the alt-right, then they came for the alt-light. Well, who is alt-light? Who determines that? What determines that? Is Ben Shapiro alt-light? Or is he just a conservative? What makes Ben Shapiro more radical or more right-wing or more conservative than anyone else at the National Review or any other anti-Trump Republican? And if we're going to lump in Ben Shapiro with the alt-right, as British commentators have done at the BBC, if we're going to call him a fascist enabler, then all of the conservative movement is equated with being fascist enablers. And at that point, there is no recourse. There is no, there is no conservative movement at that point. So we have to wonder where this is going, because obviously Donald Trump, who I think is to the right of Ben Shapiro, he was quite extreme on the campaign trail, he's not willing to do anything about the censorship of the alt-right. And I have to wonder, if someone like Ben Shapiro was censored, what would happen? What would be the legal recourse? What would be the effect from Donald Trump? Would he complain? Would he stand up? Would people defend Ben Shapiro? I guess the last hope here is that conservatives and Zionists can make a minority coalition. Now, when people hear the term minority coalition, they're thinking demographically, and they might argue and they say, no, if you add up all the Zionists in America and you add up all the conservatives, they're actually a majority. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is within the elite. I don't believe a majority, and it's difficult to say this because so many people are going to disagree. I don't believe a majority of the elite, that is the billionaire class or even millionaires, I don't believe a majority of them are Zionists. I think a majority of the elite are critical of Zionism and see it as an unsustainable project. And it's impractical and it's not useful. What is the use of having a demographic Jewish majority in the state of Israel? What's the purpose of that? Jews survive perfectly well as minorities in a number of countries. Isn't it better to just let Israel be a democratic country and not get all the bad press, all the anti-Semitism that comes out of maintaining a Jewish majority in Israel? So they're thinking increasingly that a lot of elites, most elites are not Jewish. Depending on what we're talking about, whether we're talking about media, whether we're talking about banking, whether we're talking about finance, whether we're talking about the judiciary, the government, the CIA, the FBI, most of these groups are not a majority Jewish in their leadership. You could maybe make an argument in media and Hollywood, but otherwise, most of them are not a majority. They're maybe 30% or so. And then of those, even Jared Kushner is described as this ultra-Zionist. But he said the ultimate goal for Israel is to have open borders. So Jared Kushner does not believe in maintaining a Jewish demographic majority in Israel in the long term. Now, he's in favor of it in the short term just to maintain the status quo, to maintain stability. But he eventually wants to see Israel transition into being a global state where anyone can go in there, which was sort of the original plan for Israel in a lot of respects. If you look at the different plans for Jerusalem, they wanted it to be this pan-religious state that anyone could go into. So with all that being said, it looks like Zionists, and as they're more broadly called neoconservatives, neoconservatives latch onto the conservative movement in order to be relevant, because no one in America really cares about Zionism in itself except for a very small number of people. We're talking about, a few, Sheldon Adelson and a few people who are like him, care about Zionism, are willing to fund Zionism, but the only vehicle, Zionism in itself, if you go up to a white person and you say, do you support the state of Israel? I mean, maybe if they're an extreme evangelical Christian, they'll say yes, but they have no reason to support it unless it is somehow mimetically linked in with American nationalism or European nationalism or conservatism or anti-Islam. If Zionism can be connected in with these larger things that white people do care about, then it can become politically relevant. And at the same time, conservatives are facing the same situation where they have no funding, they have no elite support, they have nothing. And so they have to sort of latch themselves onto Zionists. So there is this, what's the opposite of parasitic? Symbiotic. There's this symbiotic relationship between the Zionist movement and the conservative movement, both of which are dying, both of which are on the way out, both of which carry no water, but they're holding on to one another. And so when Ben Shapiro gets censored, the conservatives are going to back him up. When conservatives get censored, they sort of appeal to Zionists for help and backup. And again, this can work for right now, but as Zionism becomes more and more overwhelmingly unpopular, the coalition between the conservative movement, white people, and the Zionist movement is going to collapse. It's going to fracture and it's going to come apart. And it's probably going to be violent. There already is violence between Israelis and Palestinians. I don't see that as dying down. I see it as continuing. In the British Empire, or within the British Isles, the dispute between the Irish Republicans, who wanted the entire island of Ireland to be under Republican Irish control rather than British control, continued, and some even continue to this day, to launch violent attacks. They're one of the few Western, white, Northern European groups that are violent and terroristic in this way. And part of the solution to that was to open the borders between Ireland and the United Kingdom through the Schengen zone, through the European Union. So, I see the conflict between the IRA and the British government as fairly similar to that of the Palestinians versus the Israelis. And I see no reason for that conflict to stop until there is open borders and equal rights. And I think eventually a lot of people are going to wake up to the fact that, that is really the only solution going forward. Netanyahu has been in power for a very long time. He'll probably continue to be in power up until he's very old, or up until he dies, or perhaps up until he's assassinated, we don't know, or up until corruption charges are brought against him. But Netanyahu is a great connector. He's a great personality. He's able to unite a lot of extreme Israeli racists with more moderate Israeli racists. He's able to create this grand coalition. He has a force of personality behind him. He's very much like Obama. Obama was a uniter. Obama united the black community with Hispanics, with whites. He united a lot of people, and he could have very easily won a third term, I believe, if that was allowed. Hillary was very similar to Obama in many respects in terms of her policies. And that's not what people weren't turned off by Hillary because of her policy differences between her agenda and Obama's agenda. There's very little difference there. They were turned off by her as a personality, her face, her identity, her whiteness, her femaleness. So they were turned off by that. And there's a similar situation that's going to go on with Netanyahu, where at some point Netanyahu is going to have to step down or pass away, and whoever replaces him I don't think can ever match his level of connectedness into the Israeli identity, into the military, into the intelligence services. He has so many different connections within Israel that allow him to bring this coalition together. And I think at some point Netanyahu is going to fade out, and whoever comes in to try to replace him, whether it's Gantz or whoever it is, they're not going to do as good of a job, and eventually they're going to lose to not just an Israeli left, but an international Jewish community, which is less and less sympathetic to the state of Israel and the racist policies of the state of Israel. So eventually, you're going to see a point in which the Israeli left gains back control from the Israeli right, and they're going to institute open borders policies and equal rights policies. They're going to end the apartheid. They're going to allow mass immigration into Israel. The response of a lot of Israelis is going to be to flee to South America, to flee to North America, to flee to Canada, to flee to Australia. Some might even flee to the Far East. I mean, we'll see how China responds to that kind of a refugee crisis. We don't know exactly, but there are going to be many places for Jews to flee. Some of them will stay, and some of them will try to maintain their elite status as a minority within Palestinian Israel or Israeli Palestine, whatever it comes to be known as. So in this situation, that sort of thing, the whole concept of Zionism is going to collapse. And with it, because the white conservative movement has tied itself so strongly to Zionism, the white conservative movement is also going to collapse. And at that point, I can't predict what the future holds in terms of technology, in terms of, I would have never predicted that non-white immigration would be higher under Trump than Obama. I would have never predicted that. I guess it just shows my lack of imagination, but it turns out to be the case. So if demographics are changing even more quickly than I had previously predicted, I can't tell what the future holds. I can't tell how quickly things could change. And so by the time that Israel finally does become a global state, an open border state, will the conservative movement even be relevant? I mean, it's sort of a question of which is going to collapse first, Zionism or conservatism. Right now they seem unbeatable. Right now they seem to, quote-unquote, control the world, according to some people. But they're on the way out. And the collapse of one is going to mean the collapse of the other. And it's sort of a question of which one is going to stumble and fall first. Part of it depends on Netanyahu and his connections with the Kushners and Trump and other players in the United States. Certainly the election of Trump was a good thing for Netanyahu. Had Hillary come into power, I don't know how she would have treated Netanyahu. The Obama administration generally was not that friendly toward Netanyahu compared to Trump. And, Hillary was a huge part of the, foreign policy decision-making in the Obama administration. So it's questionable. It's questionable as to whether Netanyahu would have been able to survive the most recent corruption charges against him had Trump not got in. And so there's an interesting argument to be made there where you could say, well, if Hillary gotten in, maybe Netanyahu would have lost the election, and maybe the Israeli left would have taken power, and maybe Zionism would collapse. And if Zionism collapses, then white conservatism collapses. And at that point, white conservatism has to become white identity politics, white leftism, essentially. Leftism has come to mean identity politics. It's come to mean grievance mongering. It's come to mean finding one's place on the hierarchy of privilege and attacking the person directly above you. For white people, the person directly above them usually sometimes is Asian, but usually is Jewish. If you're a white person, you're looking at this sort of ethnic, racial, ethno-religious hierarchy in America and globally, the person right above you tends to be Jewish. And so if white people start playing the identity politics game, Jews are going to be the biggest losers. It's not going to be blacks, it's not going to be Hispanics, because the whole ideology of leftism at that point is to attack the person above you, not the person below you. Hispanics don't spend their time attacking blacks, they spend their time attacking whites. Asians don't spend their time attacking blacks, they spend their time attacking whites because they're the closest competitors. And this isn't something that leftism invented, but it's simply the principle of niche competition. When you have, let's say you have two completely different animals. I'm trying to think of, you have a fish in a pond and you have a bear on the land. The bear and the fish do not compete. They're too dissimilar. They occupy completely different strata of the environment, two completely different niches. The fish are eating the insects in the pond. The bears are eating, honeycomb and berries and, I guess bears do eat fish, so this is a bad example. But what I'm trying to say is that if two creatures are dissimilar enough, they don't interfere with one another, they don't compete, and sometimes they can be symbiotic. When two animals have a very similar survival strategy, or they occupy a very similar role in an environment or a society, that's when competition gets hot and heavy. So think of, here's a better one, apes versus humans. Humans aren't constantly at war with gorillas. Now, if proximity plus diversity equaled conflict, then we would expect people to be killing their dogs all the time, to be fighting cats. Humans and cats, humans and dogs, humans and gorillas, they don't fight, they don't have wars. Humans fight humans because we're similar enough to struggle over the same exact resources. Other animals, and you see this in the animal kingdom if you don't like the human example, that animals who occupy a very similar niche, for instance, the red squirrel and the brown squirrel, they fight one another, they compete for resources. Animals who occupy completely different places in the environment do not compete. So it's not just a function of leftism, but it's just a function of laws of competition. That if the Zionist movement collapses, if the conservative movement collapses, and white people do start playing identity politics, the biggest losers of that are going to be Jewish people, because white people aren't going to be looking down. They're not going to be looking at people who are not competitive with them. They're going to be looking up at the people who occupy the elite positions that they could have, but they don't because they're being outcompeted. So, those are little predictions, a little rhetoric, and that's all for now. See you guys next time. Take care. Bye-bye.